Okay, so today I'm going to talk about the Sony A9 and specifically the settings that I use for birds in flight or fast action. Now, this is not going to be an exhaustive list of settings that I might use on any given day. Rather, just get you going and have the right settings for birds in flight, sports, any kind of animals running, racing, anything. So anyway, you're going to turn your camera on, press the menu button on the back of the camera to get started. Now, before we get going too far down this road, the A9 has a button on the top left, which I'm going to show a picture of here. And the first thing I want you to do is I want you to hold in the little button, use the selector knob to change it, and change it to AF-C, AF continuous on that knob, and that'll get you to where I need you to go there. The other setting is on top, and typically you're going to want to set that to high. So you push the button in the middle and then turn it to high mode. High mode is 20 frames per second. Then there's a medium frames per second that is 10 frames per second, which I will sometimes use as well, depending on the subject I'm photographing. And then there's a low setting, which is 5 frames per second. Now, one more caveat on the A9. The A9 mechanical shutter only shoots 5 frames per second. So do not engage your mechanical shutter and think it's going to be 20 frames per second. Okay, so I'm going to move on now to the back of the camera. So press the menu button. And the first thing that comes up here is file format. And what I use is RAW. The options that you have are RAW and JPEG, or JPEG. First, let me just say that RAW offers the best quality, the best way to control highlights and shadows in post-production, and so therefore I highly recommend shooting in RAW. Optionally, you can also shoot in RAW plus JPEG, so that will give you one file in RAW and one in JPEG. JPEG is like a fully processed image. It doesn't have the ability to control highlights and shadows in the same way that RAW does. So again, highly recommend RAW. I don't shoot anything else but RAW. The next selection down is compressed. And why do I have it on compressed? The RAW file type. Why is it compressed? Because when you're shooting 20 frames per second, you don't want this to be slowed down. You don't want your buffer to be slowed down, and so you want to use compressed. What's the caveat in using compressed? Well, you're going to lose some of your highlights and possibly some of your shadows because it has to get rid of information somewhere, and so it chops a little bit of that off. Yes, you can shoot in uncompressed, but bear in mind your buffer is going to run out quickly. If you are going to shoot uncompressed, I would definitely take down your frames per second to 10 frames per second. That will help some, but it's still going to bog down your buffer. So definitely recommend compressed. Now, if I was going to shoot something else, like landscapes, then by all means go to uncompressed. It's kind of a no-brainer. JPEG quality. If you're shooting JPEGs, you can select the quality here. You can do extra fine, which is a lot of detail, do fine, a little less detail, and standard, which is less detail. I just leave mine at extra fine. By the way, to get out of any menu, you see I'm in this menu here, you'll notice it says hit the menu button to get out of the menu. So you just hit the menu button and you go back. JPEG size. Of course, I want it to be a large. I want the best quality, which is going to be 24 megapixels. You could alternatively shoot at 10 megapixels. I don't recommend that, but that's an option. Aspect ratio, I always shoot in 3:2. You can always crop later. APS-C mode. Be careful with APS-C mode, because when you're shooting at a 24 megapixel camera, if you shoot with APS-C mode, if I were to turn this on, I can indeed get a crop so that I can see the subject better. I effectively get closer to my subject by cropping in the camera. But there's always a downside, right? The downside of this is it makes it an 8 megapixel still. So I recommend leaving that either to auto or off on the A9. Now, if this was a different Sony camera, it'd be a different story. Okay, so that's all on the first tab. The second tab, I do use color space of Adobe RGB. If you do shoot JPEGs, that will help you to see more true colors. You can always change it later in post. Okay, let's go back. Nothing else to do here. Third tab, nothing else to do here. Fourth tab, nothing. Now, we're in the AF mode. Now this, the AF settings, AF1, which is the fifth tab over on the first camera at the top, first camera tab. So what you have is tabs inside of tabs. So your tabs across the top, you've got two cameras, and then you've got various other things like setting up your cards to shoot various formats, you know, doing Wi-Fi and that type of thing. So primarily we're looking at the first two tabs, so the camera is up at the top. So we're on the fifth tab in the first camera tab. Priority set in AFS. Okay, this is single shot AF. We don't care about that. We're shooting fast moving subjects here. Just leave it at balance, doesn't matter. Priority in AFC. We set the setting earlier, remember, to AFC using the top knob on the camera. This is where people, you know, you're going to have different options here, and I can go through what each one means. I set mine to release. I'll talk about that in a second. If you set it to AF, when you are autofocusing on your subject, it will not allow the shutter to fire unless it has a lock, unless AF has a lock. Okay. Now, what can happen with this is you can actually miss photographs because of that, especially with 20 frames per second. If I set it to release, that says, listen, I don't care if it's in focus or not. When I push that shutter button down, it's going to fire the shot. And then the bottom is supposed to be somewhere in between. I don't fully understand what that means, and a lot of other photographers don't either, but it's trying to get the best of both worlds. My suggestion is use release. Focus area. This is important because you can easily mess this up, and I have messed this up before. No joke. It can be done very, very easily, and I'm going to explain it here in a second to how you can do that. So if I were to select that, select the focus area. This goes in. This is just on my desk here, pointing at a window. What it wants to come up to is this. It wants to come up to wide. Nothing wrong with wide, but we're talking about photographing birds in flight. So we don't want this wide. Don't get confused. There's two wides. Don't get confused. And there's two zones, and there's two of all of these, right? Don't get confused. Okay. Scroll up, hit the up arrow key on your pad on the back of your camera. Now we are into tracking. You're always going to be looking for that tracking. We want tracking wide to start with. Why do I put this in here by default? I get this question. I was asked this question not long ago, actually. You know, Matt, why do you use tracking wide? Because the newer cameras, and the A9 is one of those, was specifically designed by Sony to take advantage of this tracking option of being locked on. Okay, tracking is the new word for locked on. They used to call it locked on in the earlier firmware versions. It's always denoted, you can see here by that arrow in the lower right corner here, by the arrow. We're looking at that icon, the orange icon. It's the arrow pointing to a button. That means you're in tracking. Also denoted by the text at the top of the screen, focus area tracking, :wide. If I hit my right arrow, hit the pad on the back of my camera to the right, okay? I want to say that's right arrow because that's what makes sense to me, which it probably actually is. Then we go to tracking zone. So now we can look at zones to track. If I hit the button again, we go to tracking center. It only looks at the center for tracking my subject. Now we're in the flexible spot. If you're really, really good, you can use flexible spot. Now we're into tracking flexible spot medium and flexible spot large. These are all options. If I go up one, expand flexible spot, okay, I'm no longer in the lock-on mode. Be careful. If I go up one, did you see that? I'm no longer in lock-on. But down here, I am tracking expand flexible spot. This is also a good one. I got asked a little while ago, Matt, why don't you tell people to use expand flexible spot? Absolutely nothing wrong with expand flexible spot. If you are a skilled photographer, you should probably be using expand flexible spot because if you're a skilled photographer and your arms are in their 20s and 30s and early 40s, if you're older, say 55 plus, you may struggle to hold that camera up to photograph with that tiny flexible spot in the middle. So for those people, I say use tracking wide. Again, the camera was designed for tracking wide. It can lock on like nobody's business, and I highly recommend that mode for this and the A7 III, or any of the alpha cameras for that matter that support it. Okay, so that's important. Tracking wide. Hit the menu key. We'll go back to here. Focus settings. Nothing to see there. Just wanted to show you because you're probably going to go, what? Why did you skip that? Focus area limit. Now, a lot of guys go nuts and would just go nuts if they saw the way I've got this set up. I literally have every single one of these selected. And all it means is they're available for me to select in the viewfinder. Okay, when I need to select a focus area. Truth of the matter is, could I get rid of wide? Could I get rid of zone? Could I get rid of center? Yeah, probably. Because nine times out of 10 with the A9, I'm going to be using these tracking ones down here. But you know what? I leave everything open because I'll tell you what. As of today, I am going to turn off these settings. Just for now. Okay? Because, and the reason I'm doing that is, one, I think it'll help you to select the right settings for birds in flight and so on if you just turn these off and only leave those lock-on settings in there. Okay? That's going to make things, I think, a lot simpler for you. Okay, the next tab, AF Illuminator. Essentially what that means is when you're in low light, it will illuminate the screen so you can see the autofocus. Okay, so the face eye AF set. Now, if you're doing birds in flight, you don't want this on. So I'm going to turn that off. However, if you are doing animals, I recommend leaving it on. The A9 does not have bird AI AF. And so it does us no value. All right. AF tracking sensitivity. Obviously, you see I've got it set to locked on. But what do these mean? It's going to come set to standard. Responsive is confusing. It just means that the AF will bounce around a lot. It will attempt to focus on anything and everything. It's going to have this very responsive feel. So it's going to zoom in, zoom out, zoom to this tree branch, zoom to this person's face. But it's, not zoom, lock on, right? Well, I don't really want that when I'm doing birds in flight, okay? I want, and standard's not bad. Listen, standard's not bad. It'll work too. Number 2 will work. But I like locked on. Locked on guarantees that it's going to track what I said I wanted it to track. So if I'm tracking, in theory, if I'm tracking the bird's head or its eye, it's going to stay locked on that eye the whole time I hold the shutter button down. Okay. So highly recommend that. AF with shutter. Okay, I'm a back button focuser, so you can ignore this if you like to use the standard shutter button to actually control AF as well. And the only reason I'm a back button guy is I've just done it for so many years. It's just something I need to do because it's part of my ritual. So no reason to actually do it as much with some of the modern cameras, but I still recommend it. All right. Now we're into the movies. We're not doing anything with the movies. The network. Not doing anything with the network. But by the way, you can control things. That's pretty cool. You can control this with your smartphone, and that can come in handy for other things, not for birds in flight, not for action. Okay. The only other thing I wanted to show you as kind of a bonus is, my menu. Okay. And I have things in here that help me, like white balance. I love to be able to control my white balance. I have it set to auto by default. And these are, by the way, my menu are things that you add. So, bear in mind, it's just a custom menu. So, okay. Shutter type. Now, this is important. And if you want 20 frames per second with this camera, you must set the shutter type to electronic shutter. There's mechanical and there's auto. Don't put it on auto. Just select electrical or mechanical. Why would you ever want to use mechanical? You wouldn't in almost every case, especially with action. So since we're talking about action, use the electronic shutter. Steady shot. Say, Matt, why is steady shot off? Because if you're shooting birds in flight, then you're probably shooting at, 1/2000th of a second, 1/2000th of a second or more. So leave that off. But you can control it on the side of your lens anyway. So okay. Format. I always put that into my custom menu to be able to format my cards. That comes in handy. Yep, delete it all. Formatting memory card. Just to show you what that looks like. And then I've got file format up here where I can change it easily. I got face IAF set here. And that's it. On the My Menu setting at the last screen is where you can add items that you want to add. So if I wanted to add, let's pick something here. Something useful. If I want to add ISO setting, I could do that right there. Now I have ISO setting. All right. All right. So I hope that helps you to get the settings that you need for your flight. Some other things that I typically will set up is, and this is up to you, but I will typically set up either a higher ISO like 1600, or I will scroll up here and set my ISO to auto, just to get you started. I'm not a big auto ISO fan, except in a few circumstances, but my number one on here, my number one set, you have two settings, or I'm sorry, 3 settings on this one. And I set my number one up to always be auto ISO. So let's go back, and all these cool settings that we have, let's go back and register them. You can register your settings. Let's go all the way back to the first tab. And come on now, come on. Okay, you can go over to the third tab, scroll all the way down to memory, and now all these cool settings I just did, I can go in here and I can save it to either number 1, number 2, or number 3. I'm going to save it to number 1. And now all I have to do is turn the dial on the top of my camera to number 1, and it automatically, let's do that. It automatically does. So there's all my settings now that we just did. So that's really all there is to setting up for birds in flight. It's, you know, you can mess around with some of these settings if you're not having a lot of good success with it. But this camera is absolutely designed for sports. It's designed to get in there and do an amazing job at fast action. It has one of the best autofocus systems made. At the time, it was probably as good or better than the Canon 1DX2, and arguably as good as anything out there today. So I encourage you to pick up this camera and just enjoy it to the fullest. Thanks for listening and watching. Make it a great day, and get out there and enjoy nature. Bye-bye.